So I have 5 player comparisons that are going to be the 2024 version of this player in 2023. And obviously the first one, everyone comes, oh, who's the Puka Nacua this year? Just going to tell you right now, not wasting my time on that. I don't know if people understand how insane Puka Nacua's season was. Wide receiver 99 to a top 6 wide receiver. Yeah, I don't think that's ever going to happen again. There's no fucking Puka Nacua this season, but I do think there is a Tank Dell. Now, Tank Dell was outside the top 70, barely being drafted, last few rounds of best ball. Nobody was talking about Tank Dell last season. And I think the Tank Dell of this season is Jermaine Burton of the Cincinnati Bengals. So, Tank Dell was the wide receiver 19 in terms of points per game before he got injured. Now, that might be a little bit high for what I would project for a Jermaine Burton breakout. However, it's really hard to pick a Tank Dell because a Tank Dell is a guy that's outside the top 70 receivers, meaning you can't pick Xavier Worthy, Brian Thomas, Rome Odunze, Ladd McConkey, Keon Coleman, like any of those guys. Like those guys are being drafted somewhat high. It's got to be somebody that nobody's talking about, and I don't know why nobody's talking about Jermaine Burton. So my number one reasoning for this, let's talk about Tyler Boyd, because obviously Tyler Boyd is gone, and that is who Jermaine Burton is replacing. So Tyler Boyd has played 4 seasons with Joe Burrow. We're just going to kind of discount last season because Burrow missed half the season, played injured, and was kind of bad. And, you know, Higgins was worse. Chase was a small step worse. Boyd was worse. Throw out last season, okay? 2020, 2021, and 2022. Let's take a look at Tyler Boyd's game log. Wide receiver 29, wide receiver 31, and wide receiver 33. All 3 of these seasons are with T. Higgins and Jamar Chase. We'll look at Jamar Chase, obviously 5, 12, and 11. He's top 12 every single season. T. Higgins will throw away last season as well. Wide receiver 28, 24, and 18. What do you notice about this? This is 3 seasons in a row of a healthy Joe Burrow, although he wasn't even healthy for full 2020 season. He supports 3 top 36 wide receivers every season. And how old is Tyler Boyd? Tyler Boyd is 29 years old. Jermaine Burton, I think, was one of the best steals of the draft. He is a actual first-round talent in my eyes. The only reason he fell to 80th overall, the 3rd round of the NFL draft, was because he has off-the-field issues. So in college, he had 18 yards per catch, which is pretty impressive. He's a really good deep threat, very talented. And Tyler Boyd averaged 96.25 targets per season over the last 4 seasons. I'm even including last season in that. The wide receiver 72, which is where Jermaine Burton is being drafted, was Trey Palmer last year, who got a total of 68 targets. So what I will say for Jermaine Burton, number one, if you play in a keeper league, Jermaine Burton is going to be beautiful because I don't think T. Higgins will be here next year and he could be the wide receiver 2 for Joe Burrow. Next, being valued as the wide receiver 72 is wild. I'm projecting a breakout. I think he will be top 36 wide receiver, but even if not, I promise you there's no shot he finishes outside of the top 50. I mean, Tyler Boyd didn't even do that last season. T. Higgins was dog shit last season, and he was still wide receiver 51. Like, Jermaine Burton will be a value no matter how you look at it. I think he will be this year's Tank Dell. Let's get into the second player. That is my guy. Actually, before I say that. So, Gus Edwards. Last season scored 13 rushing touchdowns for the Baltimore Ravens, and he was the running back 25 in PPR formats. Now, nobody was drafting him last year this high. Who do I think that's going to be this season? I think it's a fairly easy pick, and I have a lot to back this up. You're going to hate when I say this name, but you need to listen and just give me a chance. It's Ezekiel Elliott. So Ezekiel Elliott. We'll take a look at last season. He was on the New England Patriots. He finished as the RB 30 overall in a bottom 5 scoring offense in the NFL. Now he's supposed to be the RB 39, when he goes to the Dallas Cowboys, who, by the way, was the number 1 offense in points per game in 2023. Okay, well, what else is there? Well, he was competing with Ramondre Stevenson in New England. Rico Dowdle now? Okay. Okay. Well, what happened when Ramondre Stevenson was hurt? Over the past 5 or 6 games of the season, Ezekiel Elliott was the RB7 overall in fantasy football without Ramondre Stevenson. So, another thing is obviously the reason that I think he will be this Gus Edwards is because of touchdowns. So last season, Tony Pollard had the second most red zone carries in the NFL outside of Christian McCaffrey last season. He was only able to convert to 6 touchdowns because he just wasn't a good running back last season. So let's look at what Zeke did the year before last year with the Cowboys in the same exact role, competing with a very good and efficient Tony Pollard. 800 yards and 12 rushing touchdowns. He only had 5 total touchdowns last season. His over-under on Underdog Fantasy right now is 5.5 rushing touchdowns. I would smash the shit out of that. It has to do with the offense that he's in, the opportunity he's going to get at the goal line, which they already did with Pollard last year, just wasn't good enough. And something that nobody wants to talk about, receiving upside. Last season, he had 51 catches for 313 yards. Jahmyr Gibbs had 316 yards on 52 catches. These are identical stats, and everyone wants to meat ride the shit out of Jahmyr Gibbs, how amazing he is in the receiving game. Zeke did the exact same thing, and there's a tweet from Ian Hartitz of this 74-yard receiving touchdown that Zeke Elliott had that got called back for a penalty. If this wasn't called back, he would have had more receiving yards than Jaylen Warren and Jahmyr Gibbs. He would have finished as the RB25 ahead of Gus Edwards and 7 points behind Najee Harris on the worst offense in the NFL, competing with Ramondre Stevenson. And take a quick look at Mike Clay's projections. So Mike Clay, he's got projections for the season over on ESPN. They're very good projections because they are very reasonable. And he's got Zeke going for 750 yards and 6 touchdowns, 32 catches, 200 yards through the air, and another touchdown. It's a pretty reasonable one. Everyone's problem with Zeke Elliott, nobody listens. Like if I could sit here and explain why Zeke Elliott is going to be a value in fantasy drafts, it goes in one year, right out the other. Nobody cares. Zeke, pass. He's washed. He's ass. Sure, he's absolutely washed. Sure, he's not a very good running back in the NFL anymore. You do not need to be good as an NFL running back to produce in fantasy football. Like, look at Rachaad White last season. He was the RB4. He was not good at all in the run game. So when you're in a high-scoring offense like this with little to no competition for touches, with plenty of goal line work to go around, with receiving upside, I don't get the RB39 value here, guys. I don't get it. And the next guy, Mike Evans last season was valued outside of the top 30 wide receivers for whatever reason, probably because Tom Brady was gone and Baker was coming in. The Bucs were projected to be like a 5-12 team. I don't know why his ADP slipped that much. I was all over it. But anyway, he finished as the wide receiver 7 in fantasy football. And I see somebody valued outside the top 30 wide receivers. I guess he's a wide receiver 29. And I think he has legitimate top 12 upside, and he's an absolute lock to be top 24, and that is Amari Cooper. I don't understand this ADP whatsoever. So Amari Cooper, let's just look at the past 6 seasons. Last year, wide receiver 20, wide receiver 10 the year before. Back in Dallas, wide receiver 27, 15, and 10, wide receiver 19. It's an easy 1,100 yards per season and 5 to 8 touchdowns. And 30 years old, absolute lock to finish top 24. But the reason I want to talk about his upside, last season he was third in the NFL in yards per catch at 17.4. But everybody is scared of Deshaun Watson, and I'm not really sure why. So I want to take a second to talk about some splits. So I'll pop up this tweet. Weeks 1 through 3 with Deshaun Watson, he averaged 15.8 points per game. And week 9 and 10, he averaged 20 points per game with Deshaun Watson. People are scared about Deshaun Watson. They think that all of Amari Cooper's production was with Joe Flacco. And I'm going to tell you why that's a really bad take. You need to dig deeper into it. And I'm going to shout out my guy Faraz at Upper Hand Fantasy for really digging deep into it and giving me this stat that I'll pop up on the screen. So, obviously, Amari Cooper had an 11-catch, 265-yard game and 2 touchdowns. I think it was 2, possibly 3. I think it was 2 with Joe Flacco that 1 week. That week, obviously, I'm not taking that week away from him. Absolutely amazing game. Good shit. If you take that game out of the splits with Joe Flacco, then I would argue that his splits with Watson are better. So, let's take a look at his splits with that game. With Joe Flacco in that game, 9 targets, 6 catches, 109 yards, half a touchdown, 20 fantasy points per game. If you take that out, it's 8 targets, 4.5 catches, 70 yards, 0.3 touchdown, 13 fantasy points per game. Now with Deshaun Watson, 7.8 targets, same thing. 5.6 receptions, that's a catch more. 96 yards, that's 26 yards more. 0.4 touchdowns, that's more. 17.6 fantasy points per game, that's more. He was on pace in this 5-game sample size with the 5 full games, not even full games, that Deshaun Watson played. He was on pace for 95 catches, 1,600 yards, and 7 touchdowns. What are we doing here with this ADP? Are we scared of Jerry Jeudy? I don't know why we would be that. Jerry Jeudy is an Elijah Moore problem, though, not an Amari Cooper problem. If you think Jerry Jeudy is going to come in and ruin Amari Cooper's fantasy value, you're just wrong. You're just wrong. So Amari Cooper is one of the easiest picks in fantasy football. I mean, he's going after like Zay Flowers right now, which kind of crazy to me. 2 more players on this list, and one of them's a positive, one of them's a negative. We'll start with the positive, and this is a quick one because there's not as much stats to back it up because it's a rookie. Jordan Addison last year was valued outside the top 40, 45 wide receivers. Finished as a top 24 wide receiver because he almost had 1,000 yards and threw up 10 touchdowns, which was top 5 among rookies. And the rookie wide receiver that I think does that this season, finishing as a top 24 wide receiver and surprising people, is Brian Thomas Jr. of the Jacksonville Jaguars. So, I only have a couple of points here. This is going to be quick. A lot of a gut feeling going on here. I'm not going to lie. But Brian Thomas Jr. led all of college football with 17 receiving touchdowns last season in the same offense as Malik Neighbors. And Calvin Ridley, like, nobody wants to talk about the Jaguars and Calvin Ridley. Everybody thinks it was a huge disappointment. So Calvin Ridley had 25 red zone targets last season. That was second in the NFL, or third in the NFL. And he put up 8 receiving touchdowns. There's a reel. Ian Hartitz posted this video on Twitter. And it's probably 8 to 15 different plays of Jaguars receivers either dropping wide open passes, Calvin Ridley doing it himself, or just not making tough catches that hopefully these new receivers will. Gabe Davis, also not worried about him. Christian Kirk, I think, will be the number 1 guy in this offense, but I think the touchdown guy is going to be Brian Thomas Jr. He's always been a red zone guy. I don't think he'll be leading. Honestly, he could be the third option here. I think Christian Kirk and Evan Ingram are still going to remain the top 2. I'm not projecting this crazy season from Brian Thomas Jr., but I think he will see a Jordan Addison type season where he gives 800 to 900 yards and 8 to 10 touchdowns. Honestly, I want to take a look at Mike Clay's projections. Just out of curiosity, he's got him for 800 yards and 5 touchdowns. So he thinks Gabe Davis will score more touchdowns. I disagree. I think Gabe Davis sucks at football. He's going to give you a couple really good weeks. I'm sure he might throw out a 2-touchdown week or 2. So maybe that projection is fair. But I think Brian Thomas is going to be the better option in this offense. And Evan Ingram doesn't score touchdowns either. I mean, he was the tight end 2 last season, 4 total touchdowns. Let's get into this last guy. So last season there were multiple busts at the running back position. Alexander Mattison, Miles Sanders, and Cam Akers were among the top of Damian Pierce. Those four. Those four are those are the ones where everyone's like, all right, who are those guys this season? And I think it's pretty hard to pick. I only have one guy that I think could be a bust like that. And I'm going to use the Miles Sanders comparison, and you'll see why coming up here. Zach Moss, he goes towards he's going as a top 30 running back in fantasy football, and I do see a bit of the upside. But what I want to talk about, now the reason I don't want to call him the Alexander Mattison is because Madison scored 0 touchdowns, and that's not going to be the case for Zach Moss. But I do think he could be a similar disappointment, maybe not that drastic. Like I said, Madison and Sanders, those guys were bad last year. So, like, honestly, Madison, Sanders, Akers, Pierce, they all lost their starting job. So, maybe Moss does too. I don't see the drastic, not top 50 crazy, but I don't like him at his ADP. I think he's got a lot more downside than people think, so let's dive into it. My biggest point here is going to be his splits with Anthony Richardson and with Gardner Minshew. So, let's go through this. So, all of these games, I'll pop it up here, all of these games are without Jonathan Taylor. So, this is just Zach Moss as the RB1. With Anthony Richardson and no Taylor, 20.7, 9, 33.5. That's good for 21.7 points per game. Game with Minshew and no Jonathan Taylor, 22.5, 7.7, 9.6, 12.3. Good for 13 fantasy points per game. I think that people are going to be absolutely blindsided when Anthony Richardson isn't here to make Zach Moss a good running back. Let's not forget that he wasn't beating out Devin Singletary when he was over in Buffalo. Nobody wanted him. Nobody even projected him as like the starter for the Colts. It was like Deion Jackson and Evan Hull and Trey Sermon being projected without Jonathan Taylor. So not only is he not going to have the elite Colts offensive line, the elite rushing quarterback that spikes his efficiency, I don't think people are talking about how much of a genius that Shane Steichen is. That I'm just going to attribute almost 100% of Zach Moss's success last year to Richardson and Shane Steichen. And the reason that I wanted to compare Zach Moss to Miles Sanders is because last season, the reason he was such a disappointment is because in 2022 with Philadelphia, he posted career highs, 1,200 yards and 11 touchdowns through the ground. Guess why? Just take a wild guess. Oh, Shane Steichen was his offensive coordinator. That's why. Shane Steichen is an absolute fucking genius. Zach Moss is not going to have the volume in Cincinnati. He's not going to have the all this shit around him to make him look good. I think he could be a guy that scores 6, 7, 8 touchdowns, but he's not giving you a good fantasy week if he doesn't score a touchdown. So I just think he's going to be a huge disappointment. It gives me some Mike Davis vibes from a couple of years ago. So those are my 5 comparisons. I do have a couple of more, but I'm going to keep this video short. Comment below if you want me to do a part 2 for this. Maybe I'll try to find the Kyron Williams, or I won't spoil it. I got a couple other guys. Let me know. And give it a like, subscribe. I'm working really hard on these. I'm going to be doing these every single day during the NFL season. So thank you for listening, and stay tuned for the next video.